talking about that? Dried mold?
Dead mold. Because that's what it's always referred to when somebody comes back behind us. They'll say the mold's dead, so they don't need to remove dead mold. They call it dead mold.
Right. So a lot of companies are removing mold, or say they're removing mold, or just drying a space and saying that because the mold is dry, it's just a carcass, almost like a shell, and there's no reason to worry about that being in any space.
Right.
Which is untrue.
Yeah.
Because you still have mold.
Yeah.
It's just dry. So the problem is you still have the mold present. So if you're sensitive to it, you're still going to have allergies related to the exposure to whatever mold it is.
Right.
And if you're sensitive to it, you're sensitive to it. Doesn't matter if it's dry or wet.
Yep. That's what I looked up the CDC's information. I looked up CDC, EPA, Building Science Corp, all kinds of different sources. That was one thing that the CDC explicitly said was, if you're sensitive to certain spores, even if it's quote unquote dead, you can still react to it.
Right. So even if they're referring to it as dead, in this industry, a lot of guys that really may not completely understand what they're doing or understand bioaerosols or things like that may think that if they dry the space out and there's mold growing, everything's fine. But it goes from more or less a living or live state to a dry state. So you just, you're turning it into powder. I mean, with powder, which essentially makes it easier to clean up, but if it's a dust and it's airborne, you're going to sneeze, you're going to have itchy eyes, you're going to cough, whatever symptoms you might normally have.
Well, that's breeding ground too. I mean, it's just another material that new mold could use as a food source.
Right.
So it's not only can you have the sensitivities to it, but that's a potential food source for if moisture does get reintroduced into the space, new spores can grow on top of the old spores because it starts to feed on that.
Right. So I mean, I wish I could have someone edit the video and show little mold spores floating around here so we could give a visual. So it's easier, depending on what type of mold it is. Some molds are more likely to move through the air when they're wet. Some are more likely to move through the air when they're dry. So you have some molds that are real wet and sticky, like Stachybotrys. So if you take an air sample, it may not show up, but everything else shows up. So, but as you decrease the humidity and the moisture content of whatever material, you're still going to have mold there. And as some molds produce more spores when they're dry, that's my opinion. I've heard other people talk about this same topic. And their theory is kind of the same.
Yeah.
That if it's dry and dormant, it's basically just waiting for the right environment.
Right.
So, it's like a little worker bee. It's out shopping, looking for a nice flower to pollinate.
Yep.
So, more or less, it's just going to move with airflow to whatever space it can find where there might be adequate moisture.
Right. Or from an inspection standpoint too, if I'm doing a home inspection, I'm there for 2 or 3 hours. I don't know what it looked like a year before that, a month before that, or a year after that, or a month after that. So I get my little snapshot in time, and if I see mold on the underside of a floor system in a crawl space, I don't know if it's been treated or not. Whether it's dead or alive really is irrelevant to me, but how do I know that's not an ongoing situation? So it's hard for me as an inspector to delineate old dead mold versus new and growing mold. Now I'm obviously going to try to identify a potential moisture source because that's going to tell me whether it's going to continue to thrive or not. But in terms of what is actually on the materials, it's impossible for me to say that's old versus that's new.
Right.
And especially too, I'll go ahead and wait on that.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
It's like I started to have an allergy attack while we're talking about mold. But it could be the iced tea. I'm beginning to think I may be allergic to iced tea, man, because it never fails every time I drink it. I'm like,
Get cold. gonna say especially, oh, I had a thought that was going on. I don't remember it now.
It was a good one too.
I
just don't
know.
what it was.
We were talking about old versus new.
Michelle, do you know where we stopped at?
I said especially, I know I was going to a different.
No.
Yeah.
He was talking about,
Old versus new mold.
right, and about the fact that you could care less if it was still alive or dead. It just basically created a
Yeah.
pattern, and you weren't, that would be your.
Yeah.
You didn't really. I know you were going into another point, but then you
Yeah,
stopped.
yeah, I stopped. I was trying to think of what it was. Oh well. Oh, especially the ability to monitor new growth. So how can you monitor whether something is old versus new if, like I said, I'm there for a snapshot in time. If I came back a year later, how do I know what's old and new? I mean, it's impossible to say, okay, at this point you had this many spores present versus at this point you had this many spores. And air sample's not going to tell you that because you got to look at the framing.
Right.
So it's impossible to monitor. If you have a substance on the framing, you really need to clean it off so that if you come back in a year and if there's new mold growing, it's an ongoing situation.
Right. So there's no real baseline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One thing about crawl spaces too is a lot of times if you're taking air samples, which some people will do in crawl spaces,
Mm-hmm.
There's always I think a higher chance of those air samples coming back with something in it, even if there's not a lot of visible stuff going on just due to the environment.
Yeah.
So for a long time I've seen a lot of inspectors take air samples without any backup, like a swab sample or something like that, to really paint a picture of what's going on in the crawl space. So if there's something on the floor joist that maybe just a little bit, you take an air sample and it makes it's almost like a false positive.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's something that I think is a problem in this industry.
Yeah.
Is a lot of air samples are taken in crawl spaces. And maybe it comes back clean, maybe it doesn't, but if it does, then it doesn't necessarily indicate there's an issue. But if you've got visual spots on floor joists and things like that, then that's
something's going on.
Right.
Well, and taking samples from a crawl space, you're not going to, you could maybe use it as for interpretation, but your crawl space, specifically vented crawl spaces, you're pulling in outside air. So your spore count should naturally be higher because you're pulling that outside air in. That's your control sample from the outside, basically. So yeah, air sampling in a crawl space, I think you'll be largely inconclusive. So it's more of the visual aspect. If you needed to take swab samples to identify spores, you could do that. But I think visual, from a crawl space perspective, that's probably your go-to.
Right.
Because it will show indicators if there's an issue. There's going to be spores on the framing. The insulation is going to show some signs of moisture. The insulation holders, the metal pieces, those are usually going to be rusted. I mean, you can usually see if a crawl space is damp, if the environment is damp.
Right. And you can't really discern or determine the difference between old, new, wet, or dry.
Right.
I mean, even if you take a sample of it, it's not going to tell you if it's wet or dry.
Yeah.
So, using that verbiage for guys in the industry, I think is just a lack of understanding. Not necessarily ignorance in a way that they're not intelligent, they don't know what they're talking about. They may just not be as educated as they could on that.
Not as deep into the learning process on that. And that's the thing too, is taking any type of moisture readings in crawl spaces. It's good to have some moisture readings, but for a home inspection, from a home inspection perspective, if I'm there in January and I see mold all over the floor, but I check it with the moisture meter and it shows dry, I can't take that reading and say, oh, based on that, there's not an issue. Because the crawl space is probably dry during January because the humidity levels are low.
Right.
But if you came back to that same crawl space in July or August, it's probably going to be elevated. So that's where moisture readings, they're going to give you some sort of understanding, but you got to take into consideration the time of year, the extending circumstances, and then you typically will fall back on your visual indicators of moisture.